All right, so um, the last sort of segment we looked at, the late first, early second millennia, we looked at things like geopolitics, the natural environment, the medieval warm period, and its impact on the economy, right? Agricultural output, the role of the growing bureaucracy that led to urbanization, enlarged administrative structure, right, in East Asia. And then along with that was a monetized economy, an increase in education, a bifurcation in terms of the gender roles, right, in East Asia became kind of very obvious. And all of that sort of, reinforced or compounded by a growing diversity of material culture, okay, that was evident by the time we get to the end of the first millennium AD, and definitely in the early second millennium AD. So just to have a sense of what the geopolitics was like in this period around the world, Holy Roman Empire here, which is basically the Constantinople, right? The old remnant of the Roman Empire. Huge portions, in terms of a caliphate that is based in Egypt here, and then of course the Middle East with the Abbasid dynasty all the way up to about 1258. China itself through the Tang, and then all the way through to the Song by about 1278. I mean, these are large states, right? Okay, these are huge states that were pretty substantial, okay, with enlarged economic output. All of them having things like shipping lines, land, caravan lines, and all that. So the whole of the world was basically connected, okay, in a pretty intense way with large volume exchanges as a capability, but importantly, because you could ship large volumes like we do today in terms of containerization, you could ship large volumes of low unit value commodities. Okay. So it wasn't so much that you could only carry a suitcase and get on the plane, right? That's really expensive to sort of ship 25 kilograms or 50 pounds of thing, okay? Because you can only carry a small amount, right? With ships, you can actually carry large volumes. And so low value commodities became one of the most important things because of the economies of scale. Along with that, a couple of interesting things. One was, of course, ecological variation. So if you were in the southern half of China, for example, in the Yangtze River area, right, your local produce would be very different from, say, if you were up in Japan or in the Korean Peninsula, for just simply because your geographical location is different, all right? And depending on where you were on the latitude, your ecological zone differs. So the animals that are available there for harvesting are different. The plants you can grow different. Even the mineralogy, okay, the minerals that are available to you will be very different as well, okay? So the ecological variation is a very important one because different places produce different kinds of things, both in terms of primary products as well as secondary manufactured goods. So there's a huge variation there. And then when you add onto that, another variant, which is technology, not all societies in the world or in East Asia even possess the same level of technological know-how, okay? And so sometimes for ceramics is a good example. East Asia had this common knowledge by the 12th and 13th centuries, right, of the kind of glazes that could be used, the firing techniques and all that sort of thing. So ceramics became a pretty broad base, and because of that very diffuse sort of body of material that could be produced in East Asia. But when you think of something, for example, like silk, it's not until the 16th and 17th century that the techniques for brocade weaving, weaving brocades, becomes known to places like Iran, Japan, and Korea. So up until about the 16th century, China remained the only place that actually had the ability to produce brocades, okay? And so that kind of textile became a very, very expensive one because China had a technical monopoly over it. Same thing with certain other types of textiles like damask, for example. So certain things, the technological know-how provided a monopoly. And then for certain things, the technological know-how created what we call the kind of economies of scale that you could beat everybody at that game as well. So iron production is a very good example of that. China could produce large quantities of iron products because they had the technical know-how of smelting and casting iron very easily and very cheaply. Now, if you were in Japan, it's not that you couldn't produce iron, but your steel was of very high quality, right? Because of the nature of how you produced it. So the amount of time and cost for producing one samurai sword, as an example, okay, is the equivalent of the Chinese economy producing about 10,000 swords of much lower value, right? But nonetheless, they're made of iron. You see what I'm trying to say? So the quality is different. So iron that was produced in Japan, for example, is very, very expensive. And the iron products are very, very expensive. Same as well in Korea. But in China, they produce a much lower quality item, but they could produce lots and lots of it. So they could flood the markets with these products. And the fact that you could have sea shipping allowed you to capitalize on those economies of scale. Okay, so it really depends on what you want. If you want a very, very expensive item, then you probably will get it from Japan, for example, if it's an ironware. If you just were interested in iron products and the cheapest that you could possibly find, right? Then what would you do? You go to China, right, to acquire it. So kind of the same as if we think about some of the things like glassware and ceramics, for example, most of the cheapest stuff today still produced in China, right? Because they can do it, a lot of it for very cheap, but the quality is not very good, okay? If you really want high quality glass, you will not go to China. You will actually go down to Kentucky and Ohio, where the Corning company, the Corning Glass Company is the company that produces the glass for your iPhone. So the iPhone glass, which is supposed to be one of the best quality in the world, is not produced in China, right? It's actually produced in the upper Midwest by Corning. And the glass is really expensive. But you can get a replacement glass for this that's made in China that's like literally a quarter of the price, okay? But the quality is not as high. So, you know, these sorts of things happen. And as a result of that, you get regional variations, right? And regional specializations. So the trade is facilitated both internally in the countries like China, Japan, Korea, by a whole series of networks of things like roads, bridges, river barge systems, okay, that connect the internal hinterland that produces all these commodities to the external nodes, which are the port cities along the coastline. And then from the port cities, you have all these ships and the shipping networks that go out to East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, and even the East Coast of Africa. So the networking in terms of the transportation networks is actually pretty phenomenal by this point in time. We often think of globalization as a 20th century phenomenon. And in some ways that is true, okay? But more to the point, I think the process of globalization was already apparent by the time we get to the second millennium AD, okay? And we are seeing that basically manifesting itself, okay? In this period of time in terms of the economy of East Asia. All right, let me see. Okay, so this is just a map just to show you the series of bridges, because this is a fairly mountainous area of China. There are a lot of really high hill ridges, okay? And so in order to connect the three provinces that are near the delta region of the Yangtze River here, right, which is where all the major ports are located, okay? Over time, what the Chinese people have done during this period that we're looking at is to build a series of bridges that would link one area to the other. And so then goods can be transported by hand, literally on the shoulders of people, right, from one county to another across these ridges, okay? Eventually getting to some kind of a river system where there are barges and they can load it onto the barges. And then these barges then basically sail down to the port cities, right, the coastal port cities, okay, for these items to be exported. The biggest output, as an example, because this is a hilly area, which means that there's a lot of clay, right? There's a lot of clay and igneous rocks in this area. The biggest commodities that are produced in this part of China was what? Ceramics. Okay, so it's the natural sort of geological resources they have, and then plus the technical knowledge of producing ceramics. But it's pretty landlocked, and you know, in the past they couldn't get it out. But because of all these series of bridges and then the barges and so on and so forth connected to the sea coastal ports, this became one of the most important ceramic production zones, not just in East Asia, but in the world. Okay, ceramics from this part of China were exported to places like Iran, the Middle East. You find them on the east coast of Africa in excavations. It made them way all the way to the papacy in Rome, in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. So it's, in places closer, obviously, to East Asia than those as well. So pretty important sort of connection of the hinterland economies to the international economy. Okay. Japan as well became quite well connected in terms of a series of roads that took you from the coastal areas here where the ports are located all the way through the land and so on and so forth, so that the entire southern half of the Japanese archipelago was basically connected by a series of roads. Later on, it became known in the 17th and 18th century as a tribute road, right? So that foreign products would arrive in Japan, in this area near Nagasaki, and these products would be brought, in a procession all the way up to Kyoto, okay? But in this period of time, we didn't have that yet, but the roads were established in this period of time, okay? But just to show you, the connection. So a couple of interesting pictures that I thought you might want to think about in terms of the Chinese prowess, like, wow, we can do it in the 21st century. This is actually a shipwreck that was discovered just outside of the coastal port city of Guangzhou. So it's kind of near Hong Kong today. It's dated to the 13th century, and they were doing some sonar survey of the bed, the seabed, and they discovered, that there was a ship there. And they thought, you know what? Rather than just send the divers in, because it's kind of a difficult area to do marine excavation because of the sea, the choppiness of the sea, they said, we'll dig the entire shipwreck up. This is what they did. So they drove the piles in, and they basically scooped up, and this is what they're doing. They're lifting the entire shipwreck up from the seabed, and then they transported it into a museum and plonked it in there and built a museum around it. And the project has been ongoing for the last 20 years. It will actually conclude in 2021, which is next year. And this entire excavation would actually be completed. The original plan was to actually have water filled up all the way up to the top, of this tank. And then they will have the divers in there, right? Doing the marine excavation, and there'll be people looking, from the glass, kind of like an aquarium. They didn't realize that the oxidation, so basically the rotting process was exacerbated, right? Accelerated once you took it out of the seabed. It moved from an anaerobic, which is basically lack of oxygen environment, into an aerobic environment. And so they realized very quickly, oh, we can't do this, right? You notice that there's still water over here. They realized, you know what, we can't do this. So we need to drain all the water out and start excavating it as if it was like a land excavation. So that's what they ended up doing by about 10 years ago. And it gives you a sense of how massive these ships are. This is a Chinese vessel, all right, dated to the 13th century. Roughly about 90 feet long by approximately 30 feet wide. Okay, so it's a 1:3 kind of a proportion. It had about 15 chambers, all bulkheads, so they're all kind of waterproof. And they would rent out the space. I would like maybe rent out this space, for example, or this small little space, for example, if I didn't have as much money. And then as a merchant, I would fill that space up with as much cargo as I possibly could pack in there, right? So that this ship was heading out to Southeast Asia, where it would obviously unload all its cargo and trade in some port in Southeast Asia. And the same kind of ships would have headed, for example, up to Japan and to the Korean Peninsula. Okay. Does anybody know why this ship sank? Mm-hmm.
It could have been way too heavy.
Yeah, basically they put too many things under the ship, and so the ship looked like it was just basically overloaded, right? The moment it got out of port and it hit some kind of a wave, it just whoosh, the whole thing just went down. Okay, it was really unfortunate for people who invested money into this vessel because they overloaded the whole thing. Yeah.
So each of those compartments were one seller.
Yeah.
And then would someone from like their family, like how we were kind of talking about, like it was was dangerous, you would adopt a son and be like, you're going for me.
Yeah.
Would they just kind of be like, okay, this is ours, make sure it gets sold, don't come back until it's sold?
Yeah, and that actually is a practice that continued all the way through into the 20th century. And one of the things that we find in these ships, in terms of the excavation, are little bamboo tallies, like tags that have the name of the trading company, and a term that just basically refers to the term like manager, and that's how they basically denoted their cargo. And so each of these bulkheads, the spaces are obviously subdivided. You can also subdivide vertically. It's not just, in terms of the horizontal space, right? You can also subdivide vertically. So there's a lot of money going on in this thing. It is my point, but just think of it as one ship with just imagine the amount of cargo that has actually gone into this vessel, okay? Now, obviously this is not the only wreck of this period, right? But for every one wreck, there would probably be about 80 or 90 other vessels that made it all the way through and came back, okay? And so if you think about the number of ships that were operating, right, annually, okay, in East Asia, it's a pretty phenomenal amount of cargo that's exchanging throughout East Asia. Damien said, was it a design flaw? No, these ships are actually pretty seaworthy until you put too much things in them, and then they will go down, okay? Very often with shipwrecks of this nature, we only find the cause, there are only really two causes. One, they obviously hit a reef that they didn't know was there, so the navigator was not good enough. Or number two, the ship was just so full that, it just went down. And for those sorts of ships like this one, it's wonderful because you see the entire cargo, the entire time capsule, right, is intact, okay? So this is a really good example. When you find one, this is an amazing example of what trade was like, as a snapshot in the 13th century. Yeah, go ahead.
Do these ships like the one we just saw? Since we can be like, okay, well, this pottery right here with this design was made by this company, and this pottery from this design was made by this company. Are we able to see, like, in the archaeological record of, like, well, people of northern Japan bought from this company normally, from middle Japan normally bought from this company. Are we able to see that, or is there not?
And even just preliminarily, we are already seeing that in this period at the county level. So really sort of pretty precise and focused in terms of the export commodity. So we can only prove that statistically. So that's a long project. So we're kind of starting to work on that. But it seems like that's what's happening. The Koreans would order ceramics specifically from the hinterland areas around modern day Shanghai, the port city of Hangzhou, right, during that period of time. The Japanese a little further down south, but close enough because of the kind of ceramic clay and the glaze that they like, right, for their aesthetic sort of taste. In Southeast Asia, 90% of the ceramics that they actually imported from China came from the provinces of Guangdong and Fujian, which are the southernmost provinces, quite far away from the Shanghai area. So where there are two major ports located in that area too. So yeah, it's pretty specific. So when we think about the economy of this period of time, what we really are looking at, right, is what we call economic codependency, okay? Where it's not so much necessarily that you can't produce something, but it becomes cheaper for you to buy from somewhere else, okay? There are some things that obviously could be found elsewhere, in greater abundance than, like say where you are. And so because of that, it's cheaper to just simply import these materials too. So from Southeast Asia, for example, you get, natural products like aromatics, resins, construction timber, animal, products and all that. But specific to thinking about East Asia, and obviously in this case, we're thinking about China, Japan, and Korea, right? Japan, we're really sort of looking at things, very, very specific items, like gold, for example, silver.
There's actually a question for you.
Okay, and then red cedar, which is a construction timber. All right, Damien, what do you want? What kinds of business ventures were considered risky back then? International trade was a risky business, right? And part of how they would think about it is, how do I minimize the risk factor? Okay. So if I am a merchant, for example, located in a port city that has shipping lines going to Japan, one of the things that I would do is the moment I actually find somebody on the Japanese side who will be willing to take the receiving end as an agent, right, in the demand market, I will find out from them what he is able to sell. And chances are I will continue to sell that same product, right, for a really long period of time. Why? Because I know that when my products arrive in Japan and that agent receives it, he is very confident of unloading it into the Japanese market. Okay, so that's one. Number two, I will not, as a Chinese merchant, sail all the way, to Africa. Okay, no Sinbad the sailor. Okay, all right, it's like 1 in a million people. Okay, most merchants will go. If I sail, for example, to Japan or to Korea and back, that's kind of just a 1 month trip. Okay, at the right monsoon season is only 1 month. Very safe. You get there, do what you need to do, and what come back. Okay, we don't go on these adventures, to lands unknown and all that sort of thing, and meet the Cyclops and all that. Okay, we don't do that. I mean, literally, we don't do that, right? So, as a business person, you try to minimize as much of the risk as you possibly can, and there's still a lot of risk, but in this way, you can minimize the risk because one, familiarity allows you to be able to engage in commerce with confidence. And number two, if your market that you're selling to is relatively close by, right, the danger in terms of the transportation dangers is reduced dramatically. Okay, so much so that Chinese shippers knew Southeast Asia, Japan and Korea and the sea around that area very well, right? Because they've been peddling that distance quite a bit. Now, if your Chinese products need to go to India, you yourself will not be shipping it with Chinese shipping. What you do is you use either Indian or Southeast Asian shipping, right? To do the Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean shipping segment. Because they know the seas and they're much familiar with that than we would be in China. You see what I'm trying to say? Okay. So you do what we call a relay trade. And that's how you reduce the risk of commerce because there's always a lot of risk. So they would cycle stock like how we would cycle fields for planting. Yeah, in some ways they would. And things that are made in a really far away place become very expensive. But things that were made in a place that's relatively nearby, even if it's a shipping trade, right? It's an import trade, it's relatively cheap. Okay. So, we have to think about it in that way. Thinking about it in modern day terms is not necessarily wrong because actually a lot of what we see in modern day commerce is a reflection of what was going on back then. Okay. So it's not necessarily a wrong framework reference to think of it in terms of the present day. Okay. Korea was interesting. I think had a lot of products that China was primarily interested in, as well as Japan. Things like mercury, for example, which was used for lipsticks. Cinnabar is extremely red in color, and so it's wonderful for women to use as lipsticks on their lips. Except obviously you get mercury poisoning over time. All right, which would explain why they were over time very lit, right? The idea of the female beauty by the 12th and 13th century with this heavy kind of rosy red lips were all very skinny and extremely pale, okay? They would use the word fair. One could use the word pale, okay? Because they were using a lot of mercury oxide in the cosmetics that they were making. And Korea was one of the biggest suppliers of raw materials for the Chinese market for the production of cosmetics. Other things including medicinal materials like this, for example, and apparently there was a lot of gastrointestinal issues in China by this time. So a lot of natural products that dealt with gas, in intestinal issues and so on and so forth. And then even just very strange little things like mouse whiskers that were used for making brushes. I mean, like I think that's just kind of one of those weird exotic things that you would buy, right? But from China, it was ceramics, copper cash, silks, Southeast Asian products, because China would have been the first stop, right, for ships coming in from Southeast Asia laden with Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian products, right? So, and you would send some of them onward to like Korea and Japan. And interestingly, wood block printed materials like books were exported from China and particularly to Korea. Korea was experiencing a educational renaissance during this period of time. And one of their biggest source of books, printed material, actually was China. They were voraciously buying up any kind of literature that they could find in the Chinese market. And so China was producing a lot of books at that point in time with the wood block printing technology, and a lot of it was exported to Korea. Not so much to Japan, right? So Japan was not necessarily going through the same thing as Korea was, okay? Let me see. All right, so just a couple of photographs. So this is like kind of, the ceramic kiln. You throw all these pieces of ceramic and you jam it into this really big kiln that's kind of long, okay? And then you'll fire the entire kiln from all sides, right? So it's an artisanal skill, but it's a skill that requires experience and knowledge as to how to put the wood in, what temperature it's going to be inside, and so on and so forth. Here's an example of somebody. This is not an arson. Okay, this is somebody actually firing a dragon kiln in Hong Kong. One of the last that was there in 1967 or 68, I can't remember. So, it's a very, very specific skill. And then obviously, once everything is done, it's all cooled down, kind of like baking without a glass in front of you, right, in the oven door. And you open it up and voila, two things happen. Either beautiful ceramics show up or what? Everything's a mess, okay? So the skill level is extremely, extremely high, okay? Here's an example of a brocade loom, which is so complex as a machine that it took people a really long time to sort of try to decipher it, okay? But it requires two people to operate it. So firstly, it's skill and manpower, but also the amount of silk that's required to produce the brocade is extremely high. So, China had a monopoly on that. Here's another example, which is a bit more rudimentary than this, okay? And that is obviously the smelting and the casting of iron, right? So you throw the iron in, and then all they need to do is just push and pull the bellows, right? To increase the heat. Iron comes out, and it flows into these molds that are made of earthen material, and then the slag just basically goes into this particular pot, okay? Very similar to today in terms of China's challenges in manufacturing, and that is that it actually is environmentally extremely unfriendly, okay? Many of the industries in the second millennium AD actually were quite poisonous from an ecological point of view. And iron smelting and iron casting in China is one very good example of that. Okay, so some things don't really quite change very much, right? And the reason why is because obviously they can do it very cheaply, right? But there's a hidden cost to all of that. So just some objects from Southeast Asia, tin primarily, which they didn't really have in East Asia, but it was great for using as an alloy flux for casting copper coins in China. So, there was a need for this mineral that they couldn't find in great abundance in China, but other things as well, including things like spices or cardamom from India, cinnamon, cloves from Southeast Asia. Black pepper at this point in time was still produced only in India, so that was sort of exported to China in fairly large quantities. What is really interesting is these group of items. Now, Japan had quite a high level of demand for Indian Ocean products, but very specifically, they were looking for things like frankincense, glass from the Middle East, ivory that they could use to carve into things, right? And then rhinoceros horns that they could use in, sort of as carving, but also for medicinal purposes as well. So each of these different sort of kingdoms or spaces or cultures in East Asia were plugged into the international economy, but they had a very specific sort of demand, right? Based on their own consumption patterns, right, in their culture, right? And so because of that, the sum total of that was an international trade was extremely vibrant. And obviously in Japan, you can't produce the rhinoceros and neither can you produce things like the elephant tusk and all that. So what do? You export, right? You import from somewhere else, okay? And in return for that, you produce gold and silver and Japanese cedar. This is just a book print just to show you what they were looking at in Korea in terms of their demand. So they were quite voracious in terms of the knowledge sort of acquisition from China. Here's an interesting one, which I put here because the book is printed in China, all right, in the 12th, 13th century. It's a medicinal encyclopedia. So the Koreans were really interested in the Chinese knowledge for medicines. But the medicine itself, at least on this page, is a ginseng, which is actually only produced in where? Yeah, well, Japan some, but the main producer would be Korea, right? The Korean peninsula. So this is an item that obviously is produced in Korea, exported to China for medicinal purposes, right? Because the Chinese are consuming this thing, right? And then in turn, the Koreans themselves are what? Buying the medicinal encyclopedias from China, learning about how their products are being used in China. You see what I'm trying to say? And then reappropriating their knowledge. So it's a really interesting sort of, circle of information and trade and exchange that is going on, right? Yeah, it looks really aesthetic. And you can actually, if you learn Chinese, you can read this and it tells you what the users are, what it can deal with, the proportions that you would use, what you would expect to see in terms of symptoms and so on and so forth. So pretty good. Just one last slide in terms of products, and that is that the musk deer. So this is a deer that lives both in Korea, in Siberia, in the colder parts of Central Asia, and also on the Japanese archipelago. The deer itself is kind of pretty useless in terms of meat and all that. What they were going for was the gallbladder or the musk bladder of the deer, the male deer. It produces a scent, a pheromone scent, okay, that female deers obviously will be able to smell, right? And then they get attracted, and that's how they do mating, okay? They found out very early on in the first millennium AD that if you actually took out that musk gall and dried it up and you ground it down, you can actually use it as perfume. So today's cologne, the musk smell is a synthetic material, but its parent in terms of the organic chemical compound actually comes from this thing here, okay? And so this was one major export product from Japan and Korea to places like China, onto Southeast Asia, India, and so on and so forth, okay? So, and that's cinnabar. Just be thankful that we don't use lipsticks that were made of this anymore. And of course, the Japanese cedar, which was very beautiful in terms of its grain. And so for furniture making, this was a very important wood that Japan exported to China, okay? So just to round off, because we're almost at 2 o'clock, some tentative questions, one of which would be, when we think about the East Asian economy, right, during this period of time, up until about the 13th and 14th century, it's extremely vibrant and it's very codependent. The real question is, what were the effects of such an economy over this region? Okay, so on the one hand, we can think of the positive things like the breadth of the material culture that they began to enjoy, but there were other effects as well, right? So codependency has negative effects because if you are dependent on another economy for a lot of things, when that interactive relationship is severed, it does have knock-on implications, okay? And that's what we will see, I think, the next segment when we're thinking about the Mongols and the Ming Dynasty in the 14th and 15th century. When the whole system is disrupted, what happens, okay? The second thing, of course, is whether or not, this could be disrupted. And I mean, I'm just repeating myself. By the 14th and 15th century, we actually see a disruption happening. Once that is disrupted, how do you then do a substitution for things that you were importing all this time, okay? And so some of those things, I think, are pretty important questions that we need to ask, partly because they set the stage for the 15th, 16th, 17th century, right? Further down the road.